Hi everyone, this is video 3.2 and we're going to be talking about why listening is such a key component to discipleship. So far in this unit we've been exploring what discipleship is, what's a good framework to help us think about discipleship, how do we define it, what qualities make us a good discipler. And now we're going to shift gears to begin addressing how we practice discipleship. This module will focus on two foundational how-tos of discipleship. The first of these, and there's a reason it's first, is listening. Listening. If there were just one thing that you could take from this class, my hope would be that you would take with you the understanding of how truly vital listening is to discipleship. Your job as a discipler is not to give all the right answers. First and foremost, you are a listener. To help support the idea of listening as having such significance in discipleship, I'm going to approach this in a few different ways. First, we're going to look back at that relationship line that we talked about in Module 1 with you and the other person and Jesus in the middle. And we're going to see how listening fits into that and promotes that framework for understanding discipleship. Then I want to focus on specifically the evangelistic component of discipleship and how just turning around the lens through which we've typically been trained to view evangelism and looking at it from a different direction in which listening plays a key role can actually relieve a lot of the anxiety and insecurities that many people feel when it comes to doing evangelism. And then finally, I want to just leave you with a simple listening tool that I hope will be helpful for you to find it easy and natural to connect with people wherever you are in order to foster more and more discipling opportunities. So let's start by taking a look back at that two-directional relationship line. Remember, it goes both ways from Module 1 that shows the three relationships of discipleship. And remember, the whole point of discipleship is to nurture and grow the relationship between that other person and Jesus. You're discipling them to become more like Jesus. And a natural result of that can and should also be strengthening of those other two relationships. The relationship between you and the other person and the relationship between you and Jesus. If you cannot or will not listen, then you will be neglecting the relationship between the other person and Jesus. You can give all the tools, share all the knowledge you think is needed for someone to walk with God, but if that's all you rely on, there's only so far that you can take them. You have to have eyes to see and ears to hear God's journey with them, or you will be limiting God's work in their lives, and you're going to be hindering His work in your own life. And at some point, they're going to reach a point of stagnation on their journey with God. An effective discipler is not one who simply tells the other person what their journey with God is or what it should look like. An effective discipler is one who has learned how to search for God and identify Him in another person's story, and how to then help that person see for themselves God's journey with them. This immediately makes me think of Arlene. Arlene was a then 60-something-year-old woman who is a part of the Renovatus church plant that I've mentioned in a previous video. Arlene's life was, let's just say, not at all dull. She'd lived in countless places, been a part of pretty significant things along the way, and had experienced enough of life to know that God did not exist. But she was attracted to the community at Renovatus. She sat through worship and joined in small group conversations about God, and she added her own input and reasons she didn't see things the same way as other people in that group. And as she heard people talk about God and share their experiences with Him, she would politely acknowledge that that might be true for them, but in her long life full of experiences, she had not seen God anywhere. And as time continued and the small group provided more spaces for her to share her story and for those around her to respond to it, she started becoming less adamant in her conclusions about God, until one day She said to her community, "I can see now. I'm looking back on my life that I thought was empty of God, and I can see him now all along the way. He's been on a journey with me my whole life, and I didn't even know it." One of Arlene's life experiences was one that left her with a debilitating fear of water. But despite that fear, a few years after Arlene discovered God in her story, she determined her fear wouldn't keep her from responding to God's faithfulness to her. And she was baptized near the age of 70. Seeing God's journey with someone is the key to discipleship, and that cannot happen without listening, as Arlene's community did for her. Now I want to shift gears a bit to specifically talk about listening within the context of evangelism, since evangelism is such an important piece to discipleship. Several years ago, not long after we moved to Seattle to start Missio, there was a local church that was putting on a workshop on evangelism. So we thought, hey, that's a great idea for us to go and attend this. And they started the workshop by pulling out a large whiteboard and asking the audience, what are some of the fears that hold you back from sharing the gospel? And typically in those kind of large group settings, when you ask a question, it's like pulling teeth to get anyone to answer. And let me tell you, that was not the case this time. This poor guy could not write fast enough. And let me tell you, that board was jam-packed with people's fear of evangelism within like minutes. And weirdly, they didn't actually address any of those fears that I can remember from that time. They just left the board up there for everyone to stare at the whole time. I guess they were thinking maybe as they talked about evangelism, it would be inspirational enough that it could convince people that it's worth facing these fears. But as I sat there staring at those fears that they put right in front of us all that afternoon, I began to realize that they all had something in common. They were all focused strictly on the individual evangelist as the primary agent. They were things like, I'm afraid I don't know enough, or they're going to ask me a question that I don't know the answer to. I'm afraid I'm going to be rejected, or that I'm going to be looked down upon. I'm afraid I'm going to lose that friend. I'm afraid that they're going to see me as stupid. And the fear that no one was brave enough to actually voice, but I know for a fact is a fear that people have. What if they ask a question and I realize I actually have that same question? What does that say about me and my faith? I realized we've been kind of stuck looking at evangelism through a lens, starting with ourselves as the evangelist, as the primary focus, and that's where all those fears were based. But what if we just turned that lens around and looked through it from a different perspective? First, let's just start with the other person. Let's not start with me knowing everything I need to know and having all the answers and having my 3-minute elevator pitch and having my 30-minute coffee pitch. But let's actually just start with them, and let's give them the space to share their story and to express some of their faith journey, whether it's good or bad. And that takes a little bit of that pressure off. But let's not stop there. Let's actually zoom out even further with how we see evangelism, not starting from our perspective as evangelists, or even from the perspective of the other person, but what if we first see evangelism from God's point of view, from His story with His people? Our job as evangelists isn't to start with all the answers, but to know that God is at work, that He has a story with that person, and we get to listen and ask questions to try to see that story. And then we get to participate in that story by moving in our focus into that individual, asking deeper questions and giving gentle promptings. And only then do we then look at our role as evangelists in their life to see how we can contribute to help them more clearly see the gospel story in their life. And if you turn this view around to see evangelism from this different perspective, beginning with God's story, then the other person's, and then finally to yours, you'll find that most of those fears of evangelism I mentioned earlier lose some of their hold. And in order to start with God's story, you have to begin by listening. I think we're nervous that if we hand the reins of the conversation over to the other person, that they're going to derail it with accusations or confrontation or just apathy. But we personally have not found that to be the norm. What we have found is that people are so hungry for a space to process their spiritual story. And generally, society doesn't give them many spaces to do that. We've come to talk about this as spiritual vomit, when people are desperate for a safe place to talk about spiritual things. And when you give them that space, it all just spills out almost uncontrollably. And it's not unusual. It's not something we even have to work for. This is the norm for us with new relationships. All we do is we let people know we're Christians, which is really easy for us since we're ministers, so that's what we do. And we have 4 kids, and if you have more than 2 kids in Seattle, everyone's going to assume that you're either a Mormon or a Christian. So we let them know we're Christians. We show genuine interest in them, not out of a goal to invite them to Missio, but because they're a person who is worthy of relationship. And then we just listen. And let me tell you, we get so much spiritual vomit without any effort. It just comes and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Because people really are hungry to have a safe space to process their spiritual stories, even if, or probably especially if they're negative. Evangelism starts with just being a person someone can trust to listen to their story, because people are begging for that space to process. And if you go in with the goal of telling them or convincing them, they don't have permission to process, and they will put up walls. As much faith as we think people have lost in our churches and in Christianity, there's such a deep desire for a safe space for them to share that unspoken groaning of their spirit, to express those deep questions of faith. And if they can find that in you simply by you being a friend and a listener, they will trust you with their story, and you're going to be getting a lot of spiritual vomit, whether you want it or not. So have fun with that. All right, now let's get just really practical. Stan Granberg, who started Kairos Church Planting, and he also happens to be my dad, so that felt really weird calling him Stan Granberg. But anyways, he came up with the 3-question conversation that can help create opportunities for listening in new relationships. These are great for a relationship with someone like a neighbor that you know you're going to hopefully continue and develop. But it's also great for people you may never see again, like the waitress who served you your meal. So the first question is the polite question. This is something like, how are you doing today? It's the socially expected question. It's neutral, unless you happen to get one of those rare people who actually shares how they actually are doing, which is unusual. And it doesn't call for any significant or meaningful contact with the other person. Most people will end their questions and conversation here. I've done the polite thing, now we can move on and forget one another. But instead of moving on, you could then ask the next question. The next question is the interest question. The interest question is something relevant to the situation that you're in, that demonstrates that you have some kind of interest in that person, other than simply meeting the socially acceptable standards of politeness. For example, if you're at your kid's soccer game, you may ask someone on the sidelines, hey, which kid are you here with? If you're at the park, you could ask if they go to that park often. So this question begins to move the conversation out of the public sphere, the basic, how are you, that's ultimately pretty meaningless, into offering a point of connection with that person in particular. And that interest question helps you transition then to the third question, which is the caring question. So the caring question signals to the other person that you are not only interested in them, but you also care about them. The caring question often starts with something like, how do you feel about this? So if you're at a school event, you could ask how their child is enjoying the school environment there. as you're getting coffee at your usual coffee shop, you could start a conversation with the barista. And after the polite question and the interest question, you could ask them, how do you enjoy working here? So 3 simple questions: the polite question, the interest question, and the caring question. If you can get in the habit of practicing these, I think you're going to be amazed at the conversations and the spiritual vomit that come from them.